I think it's a mistake to tell a story or to interpret history or a story as linear, beginning at the beginning, moving forward through time, and then finishing at the end, for two reasons. Firstly, a story is interpreted with hindsight and is told with hindsight. If we think about the COVID pandemic, we can say that it began probably in 2019 and progressed throughout 2020, and by the middle of 2021, which is where we are now, things began to resolve in developed countries, anyway, or in certain countries, things began to resolve. But this is not a correct telling of history. It's not the appropriate telling of story, because the significance of particular events make more sense in the context of hindsight. So if you think about it from the, let's say, the bit January 2021, when we first, from my memory, when we first had significant issues in Brazil, very significant issues in Brazil, that's to understate it, offensively possibly. But when we think about the extreme effects in Brazil, and then look back to the beginning of the pandemic and how things were managed, and think about the effect of Trump, and the effect of Trump on Bolsonaro's view of the world, and the interconnectedness between Trump and Bolsonaro and that kind of attitude towards politics, then it makes far more sense to look at what led up to first of all interpret the initial thing, the problems in Brazil, the beginning of 2021, shall we say, in the context of the election of Bolsonaro, and what led to the election of Bolsonaro in Brazil, and what led to the popularism of Trump, and him ending up being the President of the United States, which again is influenced by social media, but also, it basically comes down to the 1980s and sort of the cocaine culture of New York in the 80s and all of that. But to say it comes down to that is to ignore what led up to that in the 1980s. So it obviously doesn't make sense to go back to the beginning of recorded history, just because, but the only reason it doesn't make sense is because it's not possible to go back to the beginning of recorded history. So what am I saying? I'm saying that when you tell a story, or when you tell history, it doesn't make sense to do it linearly from beginning to end. And the other side of this is that current events, or rather future fears of what will happen in the future, or hopes of what will happen in the future, affect current behaviour. And so, if I am worried about developing COVID, for example, contracting COVID, I'm going to make more effort to get a vaccine. Worried about the future, then I do things to avoid the future that I don't want. So I fear for the future, which is based on, for most people, based on some objective or semi-objective reality. Fears of what will happen affect actions in the present. So history, stories, and human life in general does not move forward. It exists in time with a forward perspective and a backwards perspective. And that's just the way the world works.